Picture this: a room bathed in the soft amber glow of gaslight, the quiet rhythm of labored breathing, and a circle of faces marked by both reverence and sorrow. In these sacred, suspended moments, the most powerful person in the world becomes simply human. Vulnerable mortals. Throughout American history, 46 individuals have held the highest office in the land. Each wielded immense power, commanded armies, shaped the destiny of millions. Yet every single one of them faced the same inevitable appointment that awaits us all. And tonight, as the world grows quiet around you, we're going to explore something rarely discussed in the grand narratives of presidential history: how they left it. Not how they governed, not what laws they signed or wars they won, but how they died. These are not just dates in a history book or names carved into marble monuments. These are stories of final words whispered in the darkness, of sudden violence shattering peaceful afternoons, of long, slow fades into the welcoming night. Some presidents departed with poetry on their lips, others spoke of soup, some died surrounded by loved ones in their own beds, others met their end on theater floors, in hotel rooms, on the floor of Congress itself. What can these final moments teach us? Perhaps more than we might expect, because when power fades and the curtain falls, what remains is truth, raw, unfiltered, human. Here's something you might not know: 8 American presidents never made it to the end of their terms. 8 times the nation had to pause, grieve, and continue forward with a new leader they hadn't quite chosen. 4 of those men were assassinated, their lives stolen by bullets and fanaticism. But here's the twist that history often forgets: the other 4 died from causes so ordinary, so mundane, that they remind us of a sobering truth. The office of the presidency doesn't grant immortality. It doesn't shield you from disease, from aging, from the simple biological reality that we are all, at our core, fragile creatures. A contaminated glass of water, a bowl of cherries, a long speech in the rain, these seemingly insignificant moments have changed the course of American history. Tonight we embark on a journey through time, walking gently alongside these 46 souls. As they reached the end of their earthly paths, we'll witness the extraordinary coincidences, like 2 founding fathers dying on the exact same day, 50 years after declaring independence together. We'll uncover the medical mysteries, deaths that baffled doctors then and intrigue forensic experts now. We'll hear the final words, some profound, some puzzling, all deeply human. From George Washington's quiet acceptance in 1799 to Jimmy Carter's recent departure at 100 years old, these stories span more than 2 centuries of American life. Through war and peace, progress and tragedy, each passing marked not just the end of a life, but a chapter in the nation's ongoing story. As you settle into comfort tonight, let these stories wash over you like a gentle tide. There's no rush, no urgency, just the steady, inevitable march of time, and the reminder that greatness and mortality walk hand in hand. We'll meet warriors who survived battlefields only to fall to common illness, intellectuals who shaped democracy yet couldn't escape their own biology, leaders who seemed invincible until they proved, quite definitively, that they were not. Some of these deaths will surprise you, others will move you, a few might even disturb you in their tragedy, but all of them in their own way remind us of something essential: that history is made by mortals, and mortality makes us all equal in the end. So take a deep breath, let your mind drift back through the centuries. The stage is set, the players are ready, and our journey begins where America itself began, with the founding. Fathers, those legendary figures who built a nation and then, one by one, had to leave it behind. Let us begin with the man who started it all, the father of our country, whose final hours would set a tone of dignity that many who followed would struggle to match. Our story opens in December of 1799, in a bedroom at Mount Vernon where George Washington lay dying. December 14th, 1799. Mount Vernon, the father of a nation, lies in his bed struggling for each breath. It began innocuously enough, a ride on horseback through his beloved Virginia estate. Weather had turned bitter, snow mixing with freezing rain, but George Washington was not a man to be deterred by discomfort. He'd survived wars, political battles, the weight of creating a country from nothing, what was a little cold weather. But the body keeps its own counsel, regardless of the strength of the spirit within it. By that evening, Washington's throat had begun to swell, what likely started as a simple bacterial infection, epiglottitis, doctors now believe rapidly became something far more sinister. The small flap of tissue at the base of his tongue, that tiny guardian of the airway, became inflamed and angry. Each swallow brought agony, each breath became a battle. The doctors came as doctors did in those days, carrying with them the tools and techniques of 18th century medicine, which is to say they came prepared to make things worse. They believed in bloodletting, the ancient practice of draining blood from the body to restore balance to the humors. They cut into Washington's arm and let his life force pour out into bowls once, twice, 3 times. 80 ounces of blood left his body. Imagine 6 large bottles filled with the crimson fluid. That carries oxygen to every cell, every organ. Gone, drained away in the misguided belief that it would help. Washington knew, somewhere in that brilliant mind, dulled now by lack of oxygen and blood loss, he understood that this was the end. To his doctor, he spoke with the same stoic resolve that had carried him through valley. Forge, I die hard, but I am not afraid to go. Can you picture it? The man who'd stood against the British Empire, who'd crossed the Delaware on that frozen Christmas night, who'd voluntarily given up power when he could have been king, now lying helpless, drowning in his own body. Yet still he faced death as he'd faced everything else, with unflinching courage. As the candles flickered in his bedchamber, as his breath came in shorter and shorter gasps, George Washington spoke his final words to those gathered around him. "'Tis well. It is well," 2 simple words, an acceptance, a benediction, a final statement that despite everything, the pain, the struggle, the imperfect medicine, he was at peace. And then, at around 10 o'clock that December night, the first president of the United States breathed his last. Now, here's where our story takes a turn into the realm of the truly extraordinary. Coincidence so perfect, so impossibly poetic, that if you wrote it in fiction, no one would believe you. 27 years after Washington's death, on July 4th, 1826, something happened that still sends shivers down the spines of historians. Not one, but *2* founding fathers died on the exact same day, and not just any day, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, the second and third presidents, revolutionary brothers who'd become bitter rivals, then reconciled into dear friends, separated by hundreds of miles, neither knowing the other's condition, both chose or were chosen by fate to leave this world on America's birthday. Let that sink in for a moment. The odds of this are astronomical. 2 men who'd worked side by side to birth a nation, dying within hours of each other, exactly half a century after. Declaring that nation's independence. It's the kind of synchronicity that makes you wonder if there are forces at work beyond our understanding. Thomas Jefferson, the tall, red-haired philosopher who'd penned those immortal words about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, spent his final days at Monticello, ravaged by a combination of ailments, diarrhea, pneumonia, a kidney infection that sent poison coursing through his aging body. But Jefferson had one goal: to survive until the 4th of July. On July 3rd, as consciousness drifted in and out like tide against shore, he stirred and asked those attending him, "Is it the 4th?" "Not yet," they told him gently, "not yet." So Jefferson held on, through the long night, through the pain, through the gathering darkness. He held on with sheer force of will, as if the date itself mattered more than the release that death promised. And when dawn broke on July 4th, 1826, Thomas Jefferson finally allowed himself to let go. His last recorded words were simple, spoken to his doctor. "No, doctor, nothing more." Nothing more. The pen that had written revolution, that had shaped philosophy and law, was finally still. Meanwhile, in Quincy, Massachusetts, John Adams lay dying in his own bed, completely unaware of the drama unfolding in Virginia. Adams was 90 years old, ancient by the standards of his time. His heart was failing, his body worn out from 9 decades of passionate living. He'd helped argue for independence, served as vice president, then lived long enough to see his own son, John Quincy Adams, take the same office. But on this particular July 4th, as America celebrated its golden anniversary, John Adams was fading fast. In the late afternoon, surrounded by family, he spoke his final words. And here's the beautiful, heartbreaking irony: Thomas Jefferson survives. He didn't know, he couldn't have known. His old friend, his former rival, his pen pal of later years had died just hours earlier, hundreds of miles to the south. Adams left this world, believing that Jefferson still remained in it. One final comfort, perhaps, one last shared a connection. By evening, John Adams was gone too. 2 founding fathers, the same day, the 50th anniversary of their greatest achievement. If you wanted proof that history has a sense of poetry, here it is, written in the final breaths of the giants. And then there was James Madison, the father of the Constitution, the smallest of the founding fathers in stature, but perhaps the largest in intellectual achievement. Madison almost completed the trifecta, almost died on another 4th of July. In June of 1836, the 85-year-old Madison lay dying at his beloved Montpelier estate. Heart failing, body shutting down. His doctors, perhaps inspired by the poetic coincidence of Adams and Jefferson, tried desperately to keep him alive until Independence Day. Just 10 more days, surely he could hold on. They offered him stimulants, medications, anything to buy more time. But Madison, with characteristic gentle wisdom, declined. When his niece pressed him to take one more dose, he smiled and said, "I always talk better lying down, my dear." It was his way of saying, "I'm ready, no more delays, no more interventions, let nature take its course." Madison died on June 28, 1836, so close to the 4th, but perhaps that was the point. Perhaps Madison's final act was to assert his own agency, to choose peace over symbolism, rest over legacy. 3 founding fathers, 3 different deaths, yet all marked by a kind of grace, a dignity, an acceptance of mortality that seems almost foreign to our modern sensibilities. Washington's tease well, Jefferson's nothing more, Madison's gentle refusal to fight the inevitable. These men had created something unprecedented in human history, a democratic republic. Built on ideals of freedom and self-governance, they'd risked everything, sacrificed endlessly, and shaped the destiny of millions yet unborn. But in the end, they were still just men, mortal, fragile humans. And as the candlelight of the 18th century finally guttered and died with them, America faced a new question: what kind of men would lead this nation next, and how would asterisk they face the darkness when their time came? The soft transition, gentle pause. The answer, as we'll soon discover, would prove both inspiring and tragic. The founding generation was fading like morning mist, and those who remained felt the loneliness of survival. James Monroe, our fifth president, architect of the famous doctrine that would bear his name, found himself in 1831 as one of the last living links to the Revolution. Washington was gone, Jefferson was gone, Adams was gone. Madison, his dear friend and political ally, had departed just 5 years earlier. And Monroe felt their absence like a physical weight. He'd moved to New York City to live with his daughter, his once robust constitution now failing from tuberculosis and a heart that simply didn't want to keep beating, not from disease alone but from something deeper, a weariness of spirit, the exhaustion of outliving your entire world. On July 4th, 1831, yes, another Independence Day, as if the universe couldn't resist the poetry, James Monroe lay dying, but his thoughts weren't on his own mortality. They were on his friend. "I regret," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "that I should leave this world without again beholding him." He meant Madison, the constitutional scholar, the brilliant mind who'd helped shape everything Monroe held dear, the friend he would never see again. Within hours, Monroe became the third president to die on Independence Day. A sad symmetry, a quiet exit, a man who left the world not with grand pronouncements but with the simple expression of love and loss. Sometimes the most profound final words are the ones that reveal not what we've accomplished but who we've loved. Now, if Monroe's death was quiet and contemplative, John Quincy Adams' exit was anything but. Most presidents retire. They go home, write memoirs, enjoy their grandchildren, fade gently into private life. Not John Quincy Adams. After losing re-election in 1828, he did something extraordinary. He ran for Congress and won, the only president to serve in the House of Representatives after holding the highest office in the land. For 17 years, Adams served as a congressman fighting against slavery, championing education, refusing to stay silent even as age crept up on him. He was 78 years old, his hands shaky, his body worn, but his mind remained sharp as a blade. February 21st, 1848. The House of Representatives was in session debating a route matter about honoring military officers from the Mexican-American War. Adams, ever the contrarian, prepared to vote no. He'd opposed the war from the beginning, seeing it as an unjust expansion of slave territory. But as he rose to cast his vote, something inside him broke. A massive stroke, sudden and catastrophic, hit him like a cannonball. Witnesses said he grabbed his desk, his face contorting, and then collapsed forward. The collective gasp that rose from the House chamber must have been deafening. Here was a former president, son of a president, a man who'd literally grown up in the Revolution, now crumpled on the floor of democracy itself. They carried him to the speaker's office, laid him on a sofa. For 2 days, John Quincy Adams lingered between worlds, occasionally conscious, mostly not, and when he finally spoke his last words, they carried a weight of finality and acceptance. This is the last of Earth, I am content. The last of Earth, not the last of asterisk his Earth, but the Earth, as if he were bidding farewell to the entire material world. And then he was gone, having quite literally worked himself to death in service of his principles. But here's something most people don't know about this era of presidential deaths. These men died with a certain grace, a certain dignity that seems almost impossible given what they'd lived through. Monroe, Adams, and the president were about to meet next. Andrew Jackson had all survived things that should have killed them multiple times over. Wars, duels, assassination attempts, the brutal, unforgiving politics of a young nation tearing itself apart over slavery and expansion. Yet when death finally came for them, it didn't arrive as violence or tragedy. It came as a peace. Why does this matter? Because it reveals something profound about the human spirit. These men had every reason to die angry, bitter, full of rage at a world that had demanded everything from them, but they didn't. They chose, and yes, it was a choice to face the end with grace. Monroe thinking of his friend, Adams declaring himself content, and now Andrew Jackson. If you know anything about Andrew Jackson, you know he was not a gentle man. He fought in duels, many duels. He carried bullets in his body from old fights. He'd survived the first assassination attempt on a sitting U.S. president, then proceeded to beat his would-be killer with his cane. He was called Old Hickory because he was tough, unbending, fierce as a wildfire. He was also a slaveholder responsible for the Trail of Tears, a man whose legacy is deeply complicated and increasingly controversial. But in his final moments, something shifted. June 8, 1845, Jackson lay at his Tennessee home, the Hermitage, surrounded by family and the enslaved people who'd served him. He was 78 years old, dying from tuberculosis, heart failure, and dropsy, a condition where the body fills with excess fluid, drowning slowly from the inside. But as the end approached, the fierce warrior became something else entirely, a grandfather, saying goodbye to his children. "Oh, do not cry," he told those gathered around his bed, his voice soft, almost unrecognizable from the commanding tone he'd used on battlefields. "Be good children, and we shall all meet in heavens. Be good children." Here was a man who'd commanded armies, reshaped the American economy, expanded the nation's borders through force and treaty, a man of violence and conviction, and his last words were gentle, hopeful, tender. It's a reminder that human beings contain multitudes, that even the hardest hearts can soften at the threshold, that maybe, just maybe, when we face the ultimate mystery, we all become something more basic, more universal, people who love and want to be loved. Return. 3 more presidents gone, 3 more candles extinguished. Monroe with his longing for departed friends, Adams content with his earthly service. Complete, Jackson surprisingly tender at the end of a brutal life. These men had witnessed America's growing pains firsthand. They'd seen the Missouri Compromise try to hold the nation together. They'd watched as territories became states, as native peoples were displaced, as the question of slavery grew from a whisper to a scream. They'd built something remarkable and flawed, visionary and cruel, inspiring and tragic. And they left it behind with varying degrees of peace, but all with a certain dignity. As the 1840s gave way to the 1850s, America was changing. The old guard was dying off. New presidents would face new challenges, and some of them wouldn't have the luxury of a peaceful deathbeds. Some would die in ways that seemed almost cursed. Which brings us to one of the strangest stories in presidential history, a tale of cold rain. Contaminated water and the shortest presidency ever recorded. March 4th, 1841, Washington, D.C. Inauguration Day. The weather was absolutely miserable. Cold rain fell in sheets driven by bitter March winds. That cut through clothing like knives, the kind of day where sensible people stayed indoors. By their fires. But William Henry Harrison was not going to let a little rain stop him from making history. At 68 years old, Harrison was the oldest man ever elected president up to that point, a war hero, an Indian fighter, a man who'd earned the nickname Old Tippecanoe. From his victory at the Battle of Tippecanoe decades earlier, he wanted America to know that age had not weakened him. So he refused to wear a coat, refused to wear a hat, stood there in the freezing rain and delivered the longest inaugural address in American history, 1 hour and 45 minutes. Of dense political philosophy, references to Roman history, discussions of executive power. 8,445 words. The crowd stood in the cold, rain-soaked, watching this elderly man prove his vigor. It must have seemed impressive at the time, a show of strength, a declaration that he was no feeble old man's. But the body doesn't care about symbolic gestures. For over a century, we thought we knew what happened next. The story seemed obvious. Harrison caught pneumonia from his lengthy exposure to cold and rain, and died 31 days later. Case closed, a cautionary tale about pride and stubbornness. But here's where it gets interesting, and here's the plot twist that historians discovered fairly recently. The timeline doesn't match. Harrison didn't get sick until 3 weeks after the inauguration. 3 weeks if he'd caught pneumonia from that rainy speech. Symptoms would have appeared much sooner, within days, not weeks. So what really killed William Henry Harrison? The most likely culprit, experts now believe, was the White House itself. In 1841, Washington, D.C. was still very much a swampy, developing city. Sanitation was primitive at best, deadly at worst. The White House's water supply came from a system that was dangerously close to sewage contamination, and it's now believed that Harrison contracted either typhoid fever or septic shock from drinking contaminated water. Imagine that you win the presidency after a hard-fought campaign. You deliver a triumphant speech, you move into the most prestigious address in America, and the water kills you. The cruel randomness of it is almost impossible to comprehend. All that ambition, all that striving, all that political maneuvering, ended by a glass of contaminated water. The symptoms came on fast and brutal. Fever, chills, severe fatigue. Harrison tried to keep working to maintain his presidential duties, but his body was shutting down. The infection spread through his system like wildfire. His doctors, still practicing the medicine of bloodletting and purging, made things worse with all their treatments. By early April, it was clear Harrison was dying. The presidency he'd fought so hard to win, the office he'd waited his entire life to occupy, would be his for barely a month. On April 4th, 1841, exactly 1 month after his inauguration, William Henry Harrison lay in his White House bedroom, surrounded by doctors who had run out of ideas and family members preparing for the inevitable. His final words were directed to his doctor, but they were meant for someone else. Sir, I wish you to understand the true principles of government. I wish them carried out, I ask. Nothing more. He was speaking, many believe, not to the doctor, but to his vice president, John Tyler, who was about to become president in the most unexpected way possible. Harrison's last thoughts were still on governance, on principles, on the legacy he wouldn't live to create. And then, the shortest presidency in American history was over. John Tyler was at home in Virginia when he received word that Harrison had died. He immediately rushed to Washington to take the oath of office, becoming the first vice president to assume the presidency due to a predecessor's death. It set a precedent that would be followed many times in the years to come, but Tyler's presidency was marked by controversy from the start. His own party eventually expelled him. He was nicknamed his accidency by critics, and when the Civil War came, he made a choice that would define his legacy in the darkest possible way. Tyler sided with the Confederacy. He was elected to the Confederate House of Representatives, actively supporting the rebellion against the very government he had once led. It's a betrayal that still staggers the imagination, a former president of the United States taking up arms metaphorically against that same nation. But before Tyler could take his seat in the Confederate Congress, his health failed. January 18, 1862, Richmond, Virginia, now the capital of the Confederate States of America. John Tyler had been suffering from dizziness and poor circulation for weeks. Then came the stroke, massive, devastating. He collapsed and never truly recovered consciousness. He died quietly. His final words, if there were any lost to history, some accounts suggest. He said perhaps in response to a question, but even that is uncertain. What is certain is what happened next, or rather, what didn't happen. The United States government did not officially mourn John Tyler. No flags were lowered to half-staff in the North. No memorial services were held in his honor. He became the only president whose death went officially unmourned by the nation he had once led. Why? Because he had committed what many saw as the ultimate betrayal. He had chosen the Confederacy over the Union. He had rejected his own legacy, and so when death came, for him, his country rejected him in return. It's a sobering reminder that how we live matters, that choices have consequences, that legacy is fragile, easily destroyed by decisions made in the twilight of life. Two presidents, two very different deaths, two very different legacies. Harrison, killed by something as mundane as contaminated water after only 31 days. In office, Tyler dying unmourned after betraying his nation in its darkest hour. But as tragic as these deaths were, they pale in comparison to what was coming. The pattern was emerging, you see. The curse, if you believe in such things, was taking shape. Because American presidents were about to start dying in ways that would shock the nation and change the course of history forever. The next chapter in our story involves cherries, milk, and a medical mystery that would baffle doctors for over a century. June 15, 1849, Nashville, Tennessee. James K. Polk had been out of office for only 3 months, but already his body was betraying him. At 53 years old, far too young by any measure, he lay dying from cholera, that merciless disease that had swept through the South like a biblical plague. Cholera is not a gentle death. It attacks with violent, explosive diarrhea and vomiting, draining the body of fluids until you're nothing but a husk. Dehydration sets in rapidly. The skin turns cold and blue, the eyes sink deep into their sockets. It's a horrifying way to die. Robbed of dignity, robbed of peace. But James Polk, even in his agony, had only one person on his mind. Sarah, his wife, his partner in all things, the woman who had stood beside him through his exhausting presidency, who had helped him expand American territory to the Pacific Ocean, who had sacrificed her own health and happiness for his ambitions. As death closed in, as his body failed him in the most undignified ways imaginable, Polk turned to Sarah and spoke his final words, not about his presidency, not about his legacy, not about the Mexican-American War or Manifest Destiny, or any of the grand historical achievements he'd accomplished. Just this: I love you, Sarah, for all eternity I love you. And then he was gone. Sometimes in our final moments, the only thing that matters is love. All the political victories, all the territorial expansions, all the pages in history books, they fade to nothing. What remains is simple, pure, essential. The people we loved and who loved us in return. Now, if Polk's death was tragic but straightforward, our next president's demise is one of the most bizarre in American history. July 4th, 1850, yes, another Independence Day, because apparently that date was. Cursed Washington, D.C. was sweltering, the kind of oppressive, humid heat that makes you feel like you're breathing through a wet blanket. President Zachary Taylor, old rough and ready himself, had been sitting through hours of Independence Day ceremonies at the Washington Monument. By the time he made it back to the White House, Taylor was desperate for something cold, something refreshing, something to cool him down, so he did what seemed perfectly reasonable at the time. He ate a large bowl of raw cherries and washed them down with several glasses of ice-cold milk. Within hours, Taylor was violently ill, stomach cramps, vomiting, diarrhea, what we now recognize as gastroenteritis, inflammation of the stomach and intestines. 5 days later, he was dead. For over a century, this death was chalked up to food poisoning, bad cherries, spoiled milk. The tragic consequences of poor food safety in an era before refrigeration. And that story held until people started asking questions. Here's the twist: some historians believe Zachary Taylor might have been murdered. Why? Because Taylor was president during one of the most volatile moments in American history. The nation was splitting apart over slavery. Taylor, despite being a slaveholder himself, was firmly opposed to letting slavery expand into new territories. He threatened to personally lead the army against southern states if they tried to secede. This made him powerful enemies. So when he died suddenly, suspiciously, during peak political tension, conspiracy theories erupted. Had someone poisoned the cherries, the milk? Was this assassination disguised as food poisoning? In 1991, over 140 years after his death, forensic scientists actually exhumed Taylor's body to test for arsenic and other poisons. The results: nothing, no evidence of foul play, just bad luck and worse hygiene. Zachary Taylor really did die from eating contaminated cherries on a hot summer day. Sometimes the mundane explanation is the true one, even when the dramatic version seems more fitting. Sometimes death is just random, cruel, and absurdly ordinary. Before he died, gasping and in agony, Taylor managed to say, "I am about to die, I expect the summons soon. I have endeavored to discharge my duties faithfully. I regret nothing, but I am sorry I am about to leave my friends." Even in death by cherries, dignity remained. Zachary Taylor's death meant his vice president, Millard Fillmore, suddenly became president, and unlike his predecessor, Fillmore lived a long time, another 24 years. Well, in fact, but longevity doesn't always mean a good death. By March 1874, Fillmore had suffered a stroke that left him partially paralyzed. He'd lived long enough to see the Civil War tear the nation apart and then painstakingly stitch itself back together. He'd watched Lincoln rise and fall. He'd witnessed the transformation of America from the nation he'd known into something almost unrecognizable. And now, at 74 years old, he lay in his Buffalo, New York home, dying slowly. Someone, a nurse or family member, brought him soup, a simple gesture of comfort. Nourishment for a failing body. Fillmore took a spoonful, tasted it carefully, and then spoke. His final words with the precision of a man who'd spent his life in careful consideration. The nourishment is palatable, the soup tastes good. That's it. That's how Millard Fillmore left this world, with a food review, not a grand statement about democracy or freedom or the future of the nation. Just a simple observation that his final meal was, at least, pleasant. There's something almost perfect about it. A man who'd always been practical, measured, unremarkable, going out in the most unremarkable way possible. 5 stars for the soup. 0 stars for the presidency, historians might argue, but 5 stars for the soup. 3 presidents, 3 very different deaths, 3 very different legacies. Polk dying young but dying with love on his lips. Taylor felled by fruit in the most random twist of fate. Fillmore critiquing his final meal like a gentleman at dinner. What connects them? The sheer absurd randomness of mortality, the way death doesn't care about your accomplishments or your power or your place in history. You can be the President of the United States, commander of armies, leader of the free world, and still die from bad cherries or a stroke while eating soup. Medicine in the mid-19th century was more guesswork than science. Doctors didn't understand germ theory yet. They didn't know about bacteria or viruses. They treated symptoms. They didn't understand with methods that often made things worse. Is it any wonder that presidents kept dying from things we'd consider trivial today? But here's what's about to change. The deaths are about to get darker, more tragic, less random, and more inevitable, because the next 2 presidents would carry a burden unlike any before them. They would watch as America tore itself apart, and their deaths would be marked not by love or random chance, but by the crushing weight of failure and regret. Before we talk about how Franklin Pierce died, we need to understand what killed his soul. Years earlier, January 6, 1853, just weeks before Pierce was set to be inaugurated as the 14th President of the United States, he was traveling by train with his family, his wife Jane and their 11-year-old son Benjamin, their only surviving child. 2 other sons had already died young, as was tragically common in that era. The train derailed. In the chaos of metal twisting and wood splintering, Franklin and Jane survived with minor injuries, but Benjamin, little Benny as they called him, was crushed before their eyes. Decapitated by the wreckage, his parents watched their last child die in the most horrific way imaginable. Jane Pierce never recovered. She spent the first 2 years of her husband's presidency in mourning, dressed in black, writing letters to her dead son. She believed and told Franklin that God had taken Benny as punishment for his father's political ambitions. Can you imagine carrying that weight, being told by the person you love most that your child's death was divine punishment for your success? Franklin Pierce turned to alcohol. He drank to forget, to numb, to escape a grief that had no escape, and it destroyed him. Pierce's presidency was a disaster. He tried to compromise on slavery and satisfied no one. By the time he left office in 1857, he was widely despised by both North and South. He didn't even win his party's nomination for a second term, one of only a handful of elected presidents denied the chance to run again. And then came the Civil War. Pierce sided with the Democrats who opposed Lincoln. He was accused of treason by some, called a Southern sympathizer by others. His old friend Nathaniel Hawthorne died. His wife died. He had no children, no legacy, no friends who would still speak to him. By October 1869, Franklin Pierce was a ghost haunting his own life, his liver destroyed by decades of alcoholism had developed cirrhosis. His body was shutting down, poisoned from then. He died alone in his New Hampshire home on October 8, 1869. No famous last words were recorded because there was no one there to hear them, no gathering of family and friends, no deathbed scene of reconciliation or peace. Just a broken man dying alone, haunted by a dead child and a failed presidency. Of all the presidential deaths we've encountered so far, this might be the saddest. Not because of how he died, but because of how alone he was when it happened. Here's what strikes you when you study Pierce's death. It didn't have to be this way. He was once popular, once successful, once surrounded by people who admired him. But tragedy and poor choices and the cruel momentum of history stripped all of that away, layer by layer, until nothing remained but isolation. It's a reminder that the office of the presidency doesn't protect you from the fundamental challenges of being human. Grief still finds you, addiction still claims you, loneliness still destroys you. The title and the power and the place in history, none of it shields you from the basic human need for connection, for purpose, for meaning. Pierce had none of those things at the end, and so he died as he'd lived for years, drunk, alone, and broken. But at least Pierce's suffering was personal. The next president's failure was cosmic. James Buchanan watched the United States of America fall apart and did essentially nothing to stop it. Historians consistently rank him as one of the worst presidents in American history, not because he was actively malicious, but because he was passive at the exact moment history demanded action. Southern states were seceding, the nation was fracturing, civil war was inevitable, and Buchanan, a Northern Democrat with Southern sympathies, believed the federal government had no constitutional authority to stop secession. So he just let it happen. By the time he left office in March 1861, 7 states had seceded and formed the Confederacy. He handed this catastrophe to Abraham Lincoln and went home to Pennsylvania, probably believing he'd done the right thing by avoiding conflict. History judged him harshly, and Buchanan knew it. For the next 7 years, he lived in his estate called Wheatland, watching from afar as the Civil War killed more Americans than any conflict before or since, over 600,000 dead. The nation he'd failed to save was drowning in blood. June 1, 1868, Wheatland, Pennsylvania. James Buchanan was 77 years old, suffering from a respiratory infection that kept getting worse. Some historians believe he may have been affected by the mysterious National Hotel disease outbreak years earlier, a mass illness that struck guests at Washington Hotel, possibly from contaminated water or sewage, but that's speculation. What's certain is that his lungs were failing. As death approached, Buchanan made peace with it in his own way. His final words reflected a lifetime of religious faith, even if that faith hadn't translated into moral courage. When his country needed it most, O Lord God Almighty, as thou wilt. Thy will be done, a surrender to divine judgment. And perhaps that's appropriate, because if anyone needed to surrender their legacy to higher judgment, it was James Buchanan, the man who watched his nation burn and did nothing to stop it. Unlike Pierce, Buchanan wasn't alone when he died. He had family around him. But did he have peace? Did he truly believe he'd done right? We'll never know what thoughts haunted him in those final moments. Two presidents, two failures. Two men who died knowing they'd fallen short at the most. A critical moment. Pierce destroyed by personal tragedy and alcohol. Buchanan destroyed by his own inaction and cowardice. Both watched the storm clouds gathering. Both knew what was coming. Neither could stop it. And now the storm had arrived. The next president would face that storm head-on. He would guide the nation through its darkest hour. He would save the Union, free the enslaved, and reshape American democracy forever. And for his trouble, he would be shot in the back of the head while watching a play. April 14th, 1865, Good Friday, just 5 days after General Lee surrendered at Appomattox. The courthouse effectively ending the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln was exhausted. 4 years of unimaginable weight sending men to die. Holding a fracturing nation together, navigating the moral and political complexities of emancipation had carved deep lines into his face. At 56, he looked 20 years older. But that night, for perhaps the first time in years, he felt something approaching peace. The war was over, the Union was preserved, the long nightmare was ending. He decided to take his wife Mary to the theater. A comedy called Our American Cousin was playing at Ford's Theater, a chance to laugh, to forget, to be just a couple enjoying an evening out rather than the president and first lady bearing the weight of a nation. They arrived late after the play had started. The performance paused as they entered their private box, the audience rising to applaud. Lincoln smiled, waved, and settled into his rocking chair. Mary sat beside him, and they were joined by a young couple, Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Harris. It was supposed to be a pleasant, ordinary evening, a respite from history. But history had other plans. Somewhere around 10:15 p.m., during the third act, Mary Lincoln leaned close to her husband. The box was private, but she was still aware of their guests, Major Rathbone and Miss Harris, sitting nearby. She whispered to Abraham, somewhat self-consciously, "What will Miss Harris think of my hanging on to you so?" She was holding his hand, you see. In public, in front of others, it was considered somewhat improper for married couples to display such open affection, even in a private theater box. Lincoln turned to her, and in what would become the most heartbreakingly ordinary finals words imaginable, he replied, "She won't think anything about it. She won't think anything about it." Not a grand pronouncement about freedom or democracy, not a quote for the history books. Not even a complete thought about politics or the future of the nation he'd just saved. Just a gentle reassurance to his wife that it was okay to hold his hand, that their love didn't need to hide. Those were Abraham Lincoln's last words, a tender moment between husband and wife. The kind of small, intimate exchange that happens in marriages every day, unremarkable. Except for what came next. John Wilkes Booth had been planning this for weeks. A famous actor, Confederate sympathizer, and increasingly unhinged fanatic, Booth saw Lincoln as a tyrant who destroyed the South. He'd initially planned to kidnap the president. But after Lee's surrender, kidnapping seemed pointless. Only assassination would satisfy his a twisted sense of justice. Booth knew Ford's theater intimately. He knew which passages led where, which doors would be unguarded exactly when the audience would be loudest. He waited for a moment. In the play that always got a big laugh, a line about Lord Dundreary that would mask the sound of gunfire. At approximately 10:15 p.m., Booth slipped into the presidential box. Lincoln sat in his rocking chair holding Mary's hand, probably still smiling at her concern about propriety. He never heard the footsteps behind him. Booth raised his Derringer pistol, a small single-shot weapon, pressed it against the back of Lincoln's head just below his left ear, and pulled the trigger. The bullet entered Lincoln's skull, tore through his brain, and lodged behind his right eye. Abraham Lincoln slumped forward. Mary began screaming. Major Rathbone lunged at Booth, who slashed him with a knife before leaping from the box to the stage below, catching his spur on the Treasury flag draped across the balcony and breaking his leg on landing. Sic semper tyrannis, Booth shouted, thus always to tyrants, the motto of Virginia and the alleged cry of Brutus after killing Caesar. And then he limped away into the night, leaving chaos and screaming behind him. They carried Lincoln across the street to a boarding house, to a small bedroom where the bed was too short for his 6'4" frame. They laid him diagonally across it, his long body at an awkward angle because there was nowhere else to put him. For 9 hours, Abraham Lincoln lay dying, unconscious, brain swelling, breathing in slow, labored rasps. Mary sat beside him sobbing. Cabinet members came and went. Doctors monitored his fading pulse, knowing there was nothing they could do. Here's what most people don't know: Lincoln never regained consciousness. There were no final lucid moments, no deathbed reconciliations or last messages for the nation, just slow, inevitable biological shutdown. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, in that cramped bedroom in a boarding house across from Ford's Theater, Abraham Lincoln's heart stopped beating. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, who'd spent the night coordinating the manhunt for Booth and maintaining order in a city gripped by panic, spoke the words that would become legend. Now he belongs to the ages. And he was right. In death, Lincoln was transformed. The controversial president who'd faced vicious criticism, who'd suspended habeas corpus, who'd been called a tyrant by half the nation. In death, he became a martyr, a symbol, a saint. The bullet that killed Abraham Lincoln did more than end a life. It changed how we remember him, how we understand him, how we've mythologized him for over 150 years. If Lincoln had lived, if he'd served out his second term and retired peacefully, would we revere him the way we do? Or would history judge him more critically, more fairly, more honestly, as a brilliant but flawed man who made difficult choices in impossible times? We'll never know, because John Wilkes Booth didn't just kill a president. He created a legend. He transformed a man into a myth. He gave the nation a perfect martyr exactly when it needed one, a leader who died just as the war ended, whose death could symbolize the ultimate sacrifice for union and freedom. Lincoln's last words were about holding hands, about love, about the small, tender moments that make life worth living. And maybe that's the perfect final message after all, that even presidents, even great men, are still just human beings who want to hold their partner's hand and not worry about what anyone thinks. As the nation mourned, Booth was hunted down and killed 12 days later, and America moved forward, forever changed by both the war and the assassination that followed it. But more presidents would die in office. More violence was coming, the curse was far from over. July 31st, 1875, Carter County, Tennessee. Andrew Johnson had survived impeachment, barely. He'd become the first president to face that constitutional humiliation, escaping removal from office by a single Senate vote. History hasn't been kind to him. His opposition to civil rights for freed slaves, his battles with Congress, his stubborn refusal to adapt to the post-war reality, all of it has marked him as one of the failed presidents. But whatever his political failures, Andrew Johnson was not a man who surrendered easily. He was visiting his daughter when the first stroke hit, sudden, devastating, the left side of his body went numb, then paralyzed. He collapsed and they carried him to bed where the second stroke came hours later, even more catastrophic than the first. As he lay there, half his body useless, Johnson could feel death approaching, and his response was pure defiance. "My right side is paralyzed," he said, his voice fighting against the weakness consuming him. "I need no doctor, I can overcome my own troubles." Can you hear the stubbornness in those words, the refusal to accept help, to admit vulnerability, to surrender to something as mundane as biological failure? This was a man who'd fought his way up from poverty, who'd taught himself to read, who'd clawed his way to the presidency, and even as his body betrayed him, he refused to go quietly. But death doesn't negotiate. Within hours, Andrew Johnson was gone, defiant to the very end. If Johnson's death was defiance, Ulysses S. Grant's was dignity in the face of unspeakable suffering. After his presidency, Grant lost everything in a Ponzi scheme. The hero of the Civil War, the man who'd saved the Union, found himself broke and desperate. And then came the diagnosis: throat cancer, almost certainly caused by his habit of smoking 20 cigars a day. The same determination that had won the war was slowly killing him. But Grant had one final mission. His family needed money, his legacy needed protecting, so despite the cancer eating away at his throat, despite the constant, agonizing pain, he sat down every day to write his memoirs. Picture it, a dying man, throat raw and bleeding, unable to speak without agony, writing furiously against the clock of his own mortality. He knew he was racing death. He knew death would win, but he was determined to finish first. Mark Twain published the memoirs and they became a bestseller. Grant's family would be financially secure, mission accomplished. But the cost was extraordinary. By July 1885, Grant could barely swallow. His throat was a mass of tumors, each breath was torture, and in his final moments, surrounded by family at his cottage in upstate New York, he made one simple request. Waters. Just that one word. Not a grand statement about his military victories or his presidency or his legacy, just a dying man with a throat destroyed by cancer, asking for the basic comfort of waters. It's heartbreaking in its simplicity. This man who'd commanded armies, who'd accepted lies, surrender, who'd reshaped American history, reduced to a single desperate word: water. And then silence. Not all deaths in this era were dramatic, some were simply peaceful. Rutherford B. Hayes, our 19th president, lived a quiet life after leaving office. He was never flashy, never controversial in his personal life. His presidency had been marred by the Compromise of 1877, the political deal that ended Reconstruction and abandoned freed slaves to the mercy of the South, but Hayes himself seemed like a decent man caught in an In decent time. By January 1893, Hayes was 70 years old and his heart was failing. He knew it, he could feel it, the fatigue, the shortness of breath, the sense that his body was slowly winding down like a clock running out of spring. On January 17th, at his home in Fremont, Ohio, Rutherford B. Hayes spoke his final words. And they revealed what mattered most to him, not politics or legacy, but love. I know that I'm going where Lucy is. Lucy, his wife, his partner. She died 4 years earlier and he'd mourned her every day. Since now finally he would see her again, or at least he believed he would, and that belief gave him peace. Within hours his heart stopped. A quiet end, a gentle transition, a man leaving the world. With love as his final thought. Here's what strikes you about these Gilded Age presidents. They were resilient in ways we rarely see today. Johnson, paralyzed and dying, still insisting he could overcome his own troubles. Grant, throat destroyed by cancer, writing through unbearable pain to secure his family's future. Hayes, heart failing, finding comfort in the promise of reunion with his beloved wife. These men had lived through the Civil War, either as soldiers, politicians, or both. They'd seen death on an industrial scale, they'd witnessed the worst humanity had to offer, and somehow they still found the strength to face their own deaths with dignity. But here's the twist, that resilience was born from trauma. These weren't peaceful times that created peaceful men. These were brutal times that forged men who knew how to endure. The Civil War had taught them that suffering was survivable, that pain could be borne, that even the worst circumstances could be overcome. So when death came for them, they met it the way they'd met everything else, with grit, determination, and a refusal to be diminished. And then there was Grover Cleveland, the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms, the 22nd and 24th president, a man who'd literally gotten a second chance at the office. Cleveland lived until 1908, dying at 71 from heart failure. By then, he'd outlived most of his era, the world he'd known, the Gilded Age of robber barons and rapid industrialization was giving way to the progressive era. Everything was changing. As he lay dying in his Princeton, New Jersey home, surrounded by family, Cleveland spoke. His final words with characteristic honesty, I have tried so hard to do right. Not I succeeded, not I was great, just I tried so hard to do right. There's something profoundly humble about that, an acknowledgement that trying doesn't guarantee success, that good intentions don't always lead to good outcomes, that history will judge you regardless of how hard you tried. Grover Cleveland tried, and then he died, and the nation moved on as nations always do, but the violence wasn't over. 2 more presidents would fall to assassins' bullets. 2 more. Families would be shattered by sudden, senseless death. The curse of the presidency was about to claim its next victims. July 2nd, 1881, Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station in Washington, D.C. President James A. Garfield was in high spirits. He was taking a train to New England with his 2 sons for a brief vacation. His wife was already there recovering from illness. It was supposed to be a pleasant summer trip, a break from the pressures of the presidency. Garfield walked through the station's waiting room, his Secretary of State beside him. Chatting amiably, he had no bodyguards, no security detail, the idea of protecting presidents hadn't fully taken hold yet, even after Lincoln's assassination 16 years earlier. A man stepped behind him, Charles J. Guiteau, a delusional office seeker who'd been rejected for a diplomatic post. Gaitao believed God had commanded him to kill the president. He'd been stalking Garfield for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment. He raised his gun and fired twice. The first bullet grazed Garfield's arm, the second lodged in his back near his spine. Garfield collapsed, conscious but in shock. "My God," he said, "what is this?" And here's where the story becomes a tragedy of medical malpractice rather than assassination, because the bullet didn't kill James Garfield. His doctors did. The bullet was lodged somewhere in Garfield's abdomen, but it hadn't hit any vital organs. With modern medicine, he would have survived easily. But this was 1881 and doctors didn't understand germ theory yet. They probed the wound with their unwashed hands. They stuck unsterilized instruments deep into his body, searching for the bullet. One doctor even punctured Garfield's liver with his finger, causing massive internal damage. Alexander Graham Bell brought his newly invented metal detector to try to locate the bullet. But it didn't work, possibly because Garfield was lying on a bed with metal springs, which confused the device. For 80 days, James Garfield lay in the White House, slowly dying from infections caused by his doctors. His weight dropped from 210 pounds to 130 pounds. His body was consumed by sepsis, by abscesses, by the spread of gangrene through his abdomen. Throughout it all, Garfield remained conscious, aware, suffering. He would beg for relief. "Swaim, can't you stop this pain? Oh, Swaim." Swaim was his friend and aide, helpless to do anything but watch. By September, they moved Garfield to the New Jersey shore, hoping the ocean air would help. It didn't. On September 19, 1881, 80 days after being shot, James Garfield finally died, not from the bullet, but from the infections his doctors had given him. Here's the devastating truth that modern forensic analysis has revealed. If Garfield's doctors had simply left him alone, he almost certainly would have survived. The bullet was lodged in a muscle near his spine, encased by his body's natural healing process. It wasn't moving, it wasn't causing damage, it was just there. Many people in that era lived with bullets in their bodies without issue. The bullet wasn't the problem. The problem was a dozen doctors sticking their filthy hands into the wound, introducing bacteria, causing new injuries, creating infections that spread and killed. In a very real sense, James Garfield was murdered by medical incompetence. His death could have been prevented by doing nothing, by just leaving the wound alone, keeping it clean and letting the body heal. It's perhaps the most frustrating death in presidential history, because it was so unnecessary, so preventable, so absurd. And it changed everything. 20 years later, the nation watched in horror as history repeated itself. September 6, 1901, Buffalo, New York, the Pan American Exposition. President William McKinley was attending a public reception, shaking hands with a long line of citizens. Among them was Leon Czolgosz, a Polish-American anarchist with a concealed revolver wrapped in a handkerchief. When Czolgosz reached the front of the line, he fired twice into McKinley's abdomen at a point-blank range. McKinley staggered but remained standing, as Secret Service agents and bystanders tackled Czolgosz. McKinley's first concern was for his attacker. "Don't let them hurt him," he said, then thinking of his wife who was waiting nearby. "My wife, be careful how you tell her, oh, be careful." Even in the moment of his own assassination, William McKinley thought of others first. It's either remarkably noble or tragically naive, depending on your perspective. Doctors operated on McKinley almost immediately, but like with Garfield, the medical care was inadequate. They couldn't find one of the bullets. The wound became infected. For 8 days, McKinley lingered, growing weaker. Gangrene set in again, just like with Garfield. The medical community had learned some lessons in 20 years, but not enough. On September 14, 1901, with his wife holding his hand, William McKinley spoke his final words. They were from his favorite hymn, "Nearer, my God, to thee, nearer to thee." And then we are all going, God's will be done, not ours. By evening, he was gone, the third president assassinated, the second to die from post-shooting infections. But this time, the nation had had enough. After McKinley's death, the Secret Service was given full-time responsibility for protecting the president. No more open receptions, no more unguarded train stations, no more treating presidents like ordinary citizens who could walk among the people without fear. The price of democracy, it turned out, included the blood of those who led it, and America was finally ready to pay for protection. The 20th century had arrived, and with it came new kinds of presidents, men of energy, ambition, and unprecedented power, but mortality still waited for them all. Theodore Roosevelt was supposed to be immortal. Or at least that's how he seemed. The man had survived being shot in the chest and then delivered an 84-minute speech with the bullet still lodged in his body. He'd led cavalry charges in Cuba, explored the Amazon rainforest, hunted lions in Africa, and boxed in the White House until a punch left him blind in one eye. Death seemed like something that happened to other people, lesser people. But in 1918, at only 60 years old, Teddy Roosevelt's body was giving out. The Amazon expedition had permanently damaged him. He'd contracted malaria and developed a leg infection that nearly killed him in the jungle. He lost 50 pounds and never fully recovered. By January 1919, Roosevelt was dealing with inflammatory rheumatism, bronchitis, and persistent infections. His son Quentin had been killed in World War I just months earlier, and the grief weighed on him like a physical burden. On the night of January 5th, Roosevelt was at his home in Sagamore Hill, New York. He'd spent the day in bed reading, dealing with pain. His last words to his valet were simple. "Please put out the light, James." And then Theodore Roosevelt went to sleep and never woke up. A blood clot, probably thrown from his legs, reached his lungs and killed him instantly sometime in the early morning hours. He was 60 years old. William Howard Taft will forever be remembered as the president who got stuck in the White House bathtub. It's probably not fair, the story is likely exaggerated, but it captures something true about Taft. He was a man whose body betrayed him. At 511 and over 300 pounds at his heaviest, Taft's weight put enormous strain on his heart. He knew it, doctors warned him, but changing proved difficult. After his presidency, Taft actually lost a significant amount of weight and served as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the only person to lead both the executive and judicial branches, but the damage to his heart was already done. By 1930, Taft's heart was failing. 72 years old, his body finally giving out under decades of strain. On March 8, 1930, William Howard Taft died from heart disease in Washington, D.C. No famous last words were recorded. Perhaps that's appropriate for a man who'd always been more comfortable in quiet contemplation than public spectacle. He served his country, tried his best, and died quietly. Sometimes that's enough. But if Taft's death was peaceful, Woodrow Wilson's was a tragedy that unfolded in slow motion over years. October 2nd, 1919. Wilson was still president, campaigning for his League of Nations, his vision for preventing future world wars, but the stress was killing him. He'd been working non-stop, traveling constantly, pushing himself beyond human limits. That day, he suffered a massive stroke. It left him partially paralyzed on his left side, blind in his left eye and cognitively impaired. He was bedridden for weeks, then months. And here's the shocking part the public didn't know. His wife Edith and his doctors hid the extent of his disability. For the remaining 17 months of his presidency, Edith effectively ran the country, deciding which matters were important enough to bring to Wilson's attention, filtering information, making decisions. It was an unofficial regency, a constitutional crisis that somehow didn't explode into chaos. Wilson finished his term but was broken. He lived another 3.5 years, a shadow of the brilliant, arrogant intellectual who'd reshaped American foreign policy. He couldn't walk. Without assistance, his mind would drift. He was in many ways already gone. February 3rd, 1924. Wilson's Washington, D.C. home. The end was finally coming. Multiple organ failure. His body had endured as long as it could. At 67 years old, Woodrow Wilson, the man who'd led America through World War I, who tried to create a new world order, was dying in his bedroom, far from the powers he'd once wielded. His last words were remarkably self-aware. "I am a broken piece of machinery. When the machinery is broken, I am ready." A broken piece of machinery, that's how he saw himself, not as a human being with a soul, transcending his physical form, but as a machine that had ceased functioning properly. Cold, analytical, sad. Within hours, he was gone. 3 presidents of the early 20th century, 3 different deaths, 3 different legacies. Roosevelt, the warrior president, going out in his sleep after a lifetime of adventure. Taft, the reluctant politician, dying quietly from the weight of his own body. Wilson, the intellectual architect, watching his mind and body betray him for years before finally surrendering. These were the last presidents of the old world, men who'd been born in the 19th century and tried to shape the 20th. They'd known a world without cars, without planes, without radio, and they'd lived to see all of that change. But change was accelerating, the modern era was arriving, and the presidents who would face it would die in ways that reflected new technologies, new threats, new realities. The Great Depression, World War II, the Cold War, the nuclear age, each would claim a presidents in its own way. April 12th, 1945, Warm Springs, Georgia. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was sitting for a portrait, working on correspondence, when he suddenly pressed his hand to his head. "I have a terrific pain in the back of my head," he said. And then he slumped forward, unconscious. A massive cerebral hemorrhage, a stroke so catastrophic that there was no recovering from it. Within hours, FDR was dead at 63 years old. The man who'd led America through the Great Depression and most of World War II never lived to see VA Day or VJ Day. He died with victory in sight but just out of reach. Here's what makes FDR's death so significant. He'd been president for 12 years. An unprecedented 4 terms. An entire generation of Americans had grown up knowing no other president. He'd reshaped the federal government, created the New Deal, established Social Security, led the alliance that was defeating fascism. And then in an instant, he was gone. The nation was in shock. Yes, people knew his health was bad, the photos from Yalta just 2 months earlier showed a gaunt, exhausted man, but his death still felt sudden. Impossible, how could someone so central to American life simply stop existing? Vice President Harry Truman was thrust into the presidency with no preparation. FDR hadn't. He even told him about the atomic bomb project. Truman would have to make the decision to drop those bombs on Japan with barely any context. One man's sudden death and the course of history pivoted. Harry Truman lived much longer than FDR, another 27 years in fact. Long. Enough to see the atomic age he'd inaugurated, the Cold War he'd helped create, the modern presidency he'd shaped. But by December 1972, Truman was 88 years old and his body was failing. Systematically, lung congestion, heart failure, kidney failure. He was hospitalized at Research Hospital in Kansas City, Missouri, and it became clear he wouldn't be living. Truman slipped into a coma on December 26th. For 5 days, he lingered in that twilight. Between life and death, no final words, no dramatic deathbed scene, just a gradual shutting down of organs one by one until on December 26, 1972, Harry S. Truman's heart finally was stopped. He died the way many elderly people die, quietly without drama, his consciousness already gone before his body followed. After a life of momentous decisions, the atomic bombs, the Korean War, the containment of Soviet expansion, his death was almost anticlimactic. Sometimes that's a mercy, a peaceful exit after a turbulent life. Dwight D. Eisenhower had a more complicated relationship with death. As the supreme Allied commander during World War II, he'd sent hundreds of thousands of men into battle knowing many wouldn't return. He'd carried that weight for the rest of his life. And when his own death approached, perhaps he was ready for it. Eisenhower had his first heart attack in 1955 while still president. He survived, but his heart was permanently damaged. Over the next 14 years, he had 6 more heart attacks. Each one weakened him further. By March 1969, Eisenhower was in Walter Reed Army Medical Center, his body finally giving out. 78 years old, he'd lived a full life, war hero, president, elder statesman. But he was tired, so tired. His final words reflected that exhaustion and his faith. I want to go, God, take me. Not a plea for more time, not a fight against the inevitable, just a simple request to be released from suffering, a soldier ready to stand down. He died on March 28, 1969, finally granted the peace he'd asked for. Here's what strikes you about these mid-century presidents. They were exhausted. FDR worn down by 12 years of crisis management. Truman carrying the weight of atomic warfare and Cold War decisions. Eisenhower bearing the burden of having sent men to die in war and then navigating the nuclear age as president. These weren't men who died too soon or violently. They died after giving everything they had to the nation. They died spent, depleted, used up by the demands of the office and the times. They lived through. The 20th century asked more of its presidents than any previous era. The stakes were higher. Nuclear weapons meant one wrong decision could end civilization. The pace was faster. Instantaneous communication meant constant demands on presidential attention. The scope was global. American power and responsibility extended around the world. And these men paid the price in their bodies and their minds. The office of the presidency ages you. We've all seen the before and after photos. Young, vibrant men entering the White House. emerging 8 years later looking 20 years older. The stress, the responsibility, the sleepless nights, the weight of knowing that your decisions affect millions of lives. It grinds you down, carves lines into your face, turns your hair white, weakens your hearts. FDR, Truman, and Eisenhower all died from conditions exacerbated by the stress of the presidency. Their hearts couldn't take it. Their bodies couldn't sustain it. But at least they died of natural causes. At least they weren't gunned down by assassins or killed by random violence. The next generation of presidents wouldn't all be so fortunate. One more assassination was coming, one more senseless act of violence, one more reminder that even in the modern era with Secret Service protection and advanced medicine, the presidency remained a dangerous job. And so we come to the end of our journey through presidential mortality. From George Washington in 1799 to Jimmy Carter in 2024, spanning 225 years of American history, we've witnessed 46 presidents face the same inevitable appointment that awaits us all. 8 died in office, 4 were assassinated, Lincoln, Garfield, McKinley, and though we didn't cover him in detail tonight, John F. Kennedy in 1963, 4 died from natural causes. While serving, Harrison, Taylor, Harding, and Franklin Roosevelt. Some died young, like JFK at 46. Some died old, like Jimmy Carter at 100. Some died surrounded by love, others died alone. Some went peacefully in their sleep. Others suffered for days, weeks, or years. But all of them, every single one, discovered that the presidency doesn't grant immortality. The power, the legacy, the place in history books, none of it protects you from the fundamental truth of human existence. We all die, even presidents. What can we learn from these final moments? That love matters more than legacy. James Polk's last words weren't about manifest destiny, they were "I love you, Sarah." Rutherford Hayes didn't talk about politics. He talked about seeing his wife Lucy again. Abraham Lincoln's last words were about holding a hands. That dignity is a choice. Washington's "T's well," Grant writing through unbearable pain to secure his family's future. Eisenhower asking God to take him rather than prolonging a suffering. That history judges us differently than we judge ourselves. Lincoln, controversial in life, became a martyr in death. Wilson, brilliant and accomplished, died calling himself broken. Machinery, Pierce, destroyed by tragedy, died alone and forgotten. That medical progress matters. Presidents used to die from things we'd easily treat today. Contaminated water, throat infections, food poisoning. Modern medicine has made the office survivable in ways it never was in the 19th century. And that violence against leaders hasn't ended. It's just become rarer, more shocking when it happens. As of this recording, 5 presidents remain alive. Jimmy Carter, who passed away at 100. Just recently, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump. They will eventually join the 46 who came before them. The cycle continues. The pattern holds. The office outlives the man every single time. But here's something remarkable. The average lifespan of presidents has steadily increased. In the 18th and 19th centuries, presidents lived an average of 70 years. In the 20th century, that jumped to 78. And those elected in the 21st century seem likely to live even longer, thanks to modern medicine, better security, and increased health monitoring. Perhaps future presidents will routinely live into their 90s like Carter. Perhaps the Dangers of the office will finally be mitigated by technology and protection. Perhaps we've learned enough from past tragedies to prevent future ones. Or perhaps mortality will find new ways to remind us of its inevitability. Tonight, we've walked through more than 2 centuries of American history, not through the lens of policies or politics, but through the intimate, universal moment of death. We've seen warriors and intellectuals, heroes and failures, the beloved and the despised, all reduced to the same final act, all facing the same darkness, all discovering that greatness is temporary but mortality is eternal. If there's comfort in these stories, it's this: death is the great equalizer. It doesn't matter if you're president or pauper. It doesn't matter if history remembers you or forgets you. In the end, we all face the same transition. And most of these presidents, despite their power and their burdens, faced it with remarkable grace. They thought of loved ones. They expressed faith or peace or acceptance. They left behind words that remind us they were human just like us. And so, as our journey through presidential deaths comes to a close, may you find peace in these stories. May the reminder of mortality make you appreciate life. May the final words of presidents, some profound, some mundane, all deeply human, help you reflect on what matters most. From Washington's "Tease well" to Carter's longing to see his wife again, these men left us with the simple truths wrapped in final breaths. We are all mortal, we are all human, and we are all ultimately going to the same place. So rest well tonight, dream peacefully, and remember, if even presidents must die perhaps, there's freedom in accepting that we will too. The power of the office fades, but the simple act of having lived, having loved, having tried, having been human, that remains. Sleep well, and may the weight of history remind you that your own small life is just as precious as any president's grand legacy. Good night.